Tell me this. What do you think of President Obama and the discussion and statements today where he said he would stand with the Ukrainian leader? What do you make of that?
Well, these are dangerous times we're living through, and God is trying us in different ways. President Obama better speak softly and carry a big stick, as Teddy Roosevelt used to say, saying that he'll stay by Ukraine and then abandoning an ally or abandoning a country we provided guarantees when they gave up their nukes in 1994 is a dangerous, dangerous business. And if we really stand by Ukraine and the Russians invade, what do we do then? That is a question I'm asking myself today.
And you've raised a number of questions, including what will take place on Sunday with the vote. It looks like it's going to go Russia's way, and people are speaking to it as it's a done deal. But there's an element within that country, you mentioned the Tartars, who are not happy about it, feel shut out, and are protesting it and have a long history of dealing with this type of intimidation.
Well, a lot of folks never heard of the Crimean Tatars. Mm-hmm. These are the guys who came in the 13th century and swept through what is today Russia and stayed in the Crimea ever since. The Tsarist Empire, the empire of the Russian Tsars, the Romanov Empire, kicked them out in droves from the Crimea into the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. And then Joseph Stalin, the horrible, bloody communist dictator who destroyed the churches and killed the priests, took the Crimean Tatars, loaded them in cattle cars, and shipped them to Siberia and Central Asia. There's only about 200,000 of them left in the Crimea, but they said they'll stand up and fight. And unfortunately, these folks are Muslim, and they will reach out to radical Muslims who are happy to fight Russians from all over the world, just as they did in Afghanistan, as they do now in Chechnya, in North Caucasus. We may end up, or the Russians may end up, getting a new front in the great confrontation between Islam and Christianity. And certainly I don't wish for that, and I hope the Russians think twice before they institutionalize their occupation of the Crimea.
How are we specifically supporting the strength of the Ukrainian government through military assets? Are we doing that? And is that a part of this?
No. It is very dangerous. We don't want to send troops to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We don't want to fight the Russians in Ukraine. Russia is a nuclear power with 1,550 nuclear warheads, 550 intercontinental ballistic missiles. We can obliterate each other many times over. We do not want a nuclear war. If we send troops into Ukraine, we're making a huge step towards the war. What we're going to do, what Obama is going to do, and the Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, will support President Obama in that, is sanctions. What kind of sanctions? Sanctions against Russian individual officials who are committing major violation of international law by violating Ukrainian sovereignty, by sending troops into the Crimea, as well as possibly sanctions against Russian banks. If the latter happens, you need to look at a country like Iran. We really caused a lot of economic damage to Iran, and the Russians will be going down the same path. And Russia is much richer and bigger than Iran, so it may take longer time. But we do have economic wherewithal to compel Russia in the long term to change its policy.
So we're looking at long term in the response to this. Should we look at the fact of short term, looking at the Crimean Peninsula and saying, hey, it's back in Russia's hands, and then look at a long-term strategy, including economic sanctions and an energy program that would bolster the Ukraine as well as our European allies?
Well, here's the deal. If we don't do anything, the Russians will feel empowered and walk into eastern Ukraine. I think even if we do sanctions now, the Russians are on so much adrenaline. Putin is on so much adrenaline, he will still walk into eastern Ukraine. The Crimea, as my colleagues at a conference today at the Heritage Foundation said, the Crimea is the beginning. It's not the end. And if they walk into eastern Ukraine, they may not stop there if Ukrainians don't shoot. It's also up to the Ukrainians, frankly, to make steps to protect their sovereignty, to protect their territory, to protect their turf. If they don't fight, they cannot expect us to fight for them. But in the long term, as I said, finance, energy, things like that will hurt Russia, and the Russians would be advised not to hurt themselves, not to shoot themselves in the foot. I made a back-of-the-envelope calculation. The Russians lost already over $100 billion in 2 weeks by their stock market dropping 11%, by capital fleeing out of Russia, and by Western investment being canceled. And I said so in interviews to Russian TV channels. But if they're not thinking straight, if they're not thinking rationally, we may stumble into a war. And unfortunately, history teaches us that, for example, World War I, the great powers stumbled into it. They didn't really want a huge war in which 15 or 20 million people died, but they did. It was a horrible war. And, of course, World War II, which was an attempt by the Germans to revenge themselves, to override the loss of World War I, and of course it failed. That was another much more horrible war in which 55 million people died. So hopefully, I pray to God that the Russians will not make the same mistake.
And we are praying as well, but those are the wages of appeasement, as the great Bruce Thornton would say, regarding what World War I and it leading to World War II of what we've seen. Would you advise us to withdraw from the START treaty that President Obama pretty much gave in his opening of his presidency, as well as to recommit to the missile shield for the Czech Republic and Poland?
I think definitely with the missile shield in the Czech Republic and Poland, that was a step that demonstrated to the Russians' weakness. I will say another thing, and
yes,
that
sir.
is that once the Obama administration started demonstrating to the Russians that we are not interested in the former Soviet countries, we do not boost their sovereignty, we do not boost their military forces in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Kazakhstan, etc., the Russians interpreted it as American weakness, and now we have the Crimea, now we have Ukraine, and we don't know whether the Russian forces are going to stop. I think at least we're looking long-term for a protracted friction and conflict, and again, I hope it's not going to end up in a shooting war in Europe. The last thing we need in Europe is a shooting war.
Right. Absolutely, in the sense of that being an awful outcome, but as what I'm gathering from you is what you're hoping for and what the reality is, and Putin's nature. You've met Putin, you understand what drives this man, and as he sees President Obama, it doesn't seem to me he's going to stop until he gets a lot of resistance where it hurts. I understand the economic sanctions in that, but you just talked about the Russians being jacked up going into the eastern Ukraine saying, hey, we're going to keep going. So what truly can stop them? Because our president makes these statements, but like a red line, it becomes pink very quickly.
Well, at some point, unfortunately, if the president is retreating, at some point he may decide to make a stand. When the U.S. makes stands, and it happened twice in the past, both times with the USSR, with the Soviet Union. The first time it happened under President Kennedy's watch in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The nuclear forces of both countries, of the USSR and of the United States, went on high alert. We were on a hair trigger alert to shoot at each other nuclear weapons. Thankfully, some cooler heads prevailed, both in the Kremlin and in the United States. The second time, it was under President Richard Nixon and the Russian leader named Leonid Brezhnev, the guy with bushy eyebrows, for those of us who are old enough to remember Brezhnev. This was over the war in the Middle East. Israel was close to a decisive defeat against Egypt and Syria in the so-called Yom Kippur War of 1973. The Russians alerted 6 paratroop divisions they were willing to fly into the Middle East to fight the Jewish state. President Nixon, who was no great fan of the Jews, decided this is time to stop the USSR, to prevent their aggression in the Middle East, put our forces on high alert, and told Leonid Brezhnev, with whom he met several times, hey, Leonid, do you really want to destroy your country and mine over this business? And both sides stepped down. The Israelis stopped their military advances against the Egyptian capital, Cairo, and the Syrian capital, Damascus. They were in a cannon range of Damascus, less than 35 clicks. So when the coup has prevailed, we can walk this back. But so far from what I see, the Russians are not budging. The Russians are not afraid. The Russians are not worried. Maybe if we put 2 carrier battle groups in the range of Russia, in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, things would have changed. But so far, President Obama did not do it.
So the 2 instances you speak to, one, we had to give up missiles, but that was held to be, that was quieted, Khrushchev. And in the other, it has to go to the point of saying they have to believe us that we are willing to go all the way. And it seems to me we have a president who does not convey that or believe in that. He believes nuclear weapons are the enemy as opposed to the enemy or people having nuclear weapons who being the enemy. And I am no fan of nuclear weapons. I don't think anybody truly is, but the necessity and the importance of them in this age. So it doesn't look good. Ariel, I'm just translating here. I'm a simple guy, but I'm getting from you, brilliant man yourself, tell me this. You're saying it's not going to get better until President Obama demonstrates that he is willing to go all the way in the sense of stopping them fully, and that would mean President Putin would sit there and say, I'm not willing to risk everything on this.
Right, and we can do it in a number of ways without going to a nuclear alert or without putting troops in Ukraine. I'm not in favor of putting troops in Ukraine, but I want to make it very clear to Mr. Putin by, for example, putting missile defenses to protect our allies in Europe, by putting carrier battle groups in the position where we, God forbid, if we need it, we have overwhelming force, by supporting our allies in the Baltic states, and by telling Putin, look, any entry into Ukraine, you will pay a price which is unacceptable for Russia. Unfortunately, all the lecturing from Obama and Secretary of State Kerry so far did not stop the Russian troop concentration. The Russians are concentrating up to 250,000 battle-ready troops in the guise of military maneuvers. Putin said the maneuvers will be over by March 3rd. They're not. He is continuing to keep these troops and amassing armor along the eastern border of Ukraine, and this is a region where a lot of Russian speakers live, and he thinks that at least in the Russian-speaking areas, they may be happy to greet the Russian invading force. I think in the long term, if they do it, the Russians will shoot themselves in the foot. They will destroy foreign investment. They will make their country miserable. But on the other hand, I also know what's going on inside Russia. Putin doesn't mind that his people think that they are surrounded by foreign enemies. He doesn't mind to have an authoritarian regime and not a democracy. He doesn't mind that Russian people will be afraid. We've seen examples of that with Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, and even in darker pages of European history when leaders that died in bunkers in 1945 kept telling the German people that they're surrounded and attacked from all sides.
Dr. Cohen, Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, I just want to say thank you. I wish we had more time, but you made a lot of it for us tonight, and we always appreciate it. We're praying for the people of the Ukraine and those and a part of that obviously in the Crimean Peninsula. And we appreciate you, my friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and God bless.
God bless. Take care. There you go. Wow. There's a lot to digest there. It's longer than the title, so I don't have time. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. More on the flip side. AFR Talk.